Hi everybody, Bob Olson here with Afterlife TV. You can find us at afterlifetv.com. This is where we search for evidence of life after death and ask the meaningful questions around that subject. Boy, today's subject, it's very meaningful. Something that we have never covered before. Something that I'm going to comment in a moment about how important I think it is. But our expert guest today is Dr. Lani Leary. Did I say that correctly?
Lani, yes.
We are
Leary.
so happy to have you here. Thank you very much for getting up early and doing this interview.
Yes, you're welcome. Happy to do it.
Lani is the author of this book here, No One Dies Alone.
No one has to die alone.
No one has to die alone. Wouldn't it be nice if nobody died alone?
Yeah.
Preparing for a meaningful death. Boy, that I was just saying to Lani, I'll just speak to the audience. I was just saying to Lani before we started that this is one of those books that to me is so important because in our society, in the United States especially, it's one of those subjects. Death is one of those subjects that people tend to not really want to think about, never mind talk about, never mind read about. I want to give her credit for writing this and the publisher a lot of credit for publishing it, because I don't think this is ever going to be one of those subjects that someone writes about and becomes this big New York Times bestseller for that very reason. And yet, at the same time, and the reason that I'm doing this show today is that I think it is probably one of the most important subjects that we need to talk about, that we need to talk about with one another, that we need to talk about with our children, that this subject needs to be discussed. Do you agree?
Yeah, we need to bring it out of the closet and put it on the dining room table and talk about it like we talk about birth and sex and finances and all the other subjects that used to be taboo.
Why is it that it became this way? You know, I remember when my grandfather passed. He lived in our house, and I didn't even really realize he had died. I wasn't sure what happened. His room was empty. What's going on? Why did our society become like this, where some other societies are much more comfortable with talking about death?
Well, yes, other cultures, societies, keep the elders in their home, and so they see the process of aging and declining, and it's part of the normal rhythm of life. And so people are less afraid of it because it's woven into the fabric of their life.
Yeah.
And when 100 years ago, we used to have a parlor where we would bring our deceased loved one down into the parlor, and the women would cleanse the body and dress the body while the men were outside in the workshop building the coffin. Everyone was participating. Everyone was a community, and in being that kind of community and working together, they were already in the process of healing their grief. They were soothing each other, comforting each other by being there. And then they all walked the casket and they dug the hole and they buried their loved one all together. So it was just part of life, and they didn't push away from it. Now we have our aging and our ill loved ones dying in the hospital where they don't want to be. Right. But they're removed from us. And when we don't have the exposure, it becomes a mystery. And so death, we start fearing death and we move away from it. We do not become involved in it, and it becomes bigger than us. Yeah. We now have industries built around, taking it away from the unpleasantness of life. So everything is anesthetized, kind of. So bury our dead. We don't dress our dead. We don't officiate at the ceremony, and we don't dig the grave. We don't put our loved ones to rest.
Well, that's so true. And when my grandfather passed, I was 10. Do you think things have improved or got worse since then? That was 73, I think.
They've gotten worse.
Yeah.
No. Yeah, they've gotten worse, except for the hospice movement and the palliative care movement. Hopefully that's going to bring it back into the public arena, and there will be more education, and it'll be more commonplace. But we don't even have language for death and dying. We have euphemisms, And we do our young, especially our youth, such a disservice because we teach them to be afraid of death and dying. Children are not afraid of it unless they're taught to.
Oh, that's interesting. Because I was kind of thinking it was more like, we're afraid of what we don't know, which, we see this with all sorts of things in society, but, we don't understand, if you didn't grow up with a certain race or something, you might be afraid of them because it's unusual to you,
Right.
I see that with homosexuality. You grow up, right. You don't know anybody who's gay.
Right.
You might have some weird, odd thoughts and fears about it. Then all of a sudden you end up with a friend who is, and all of that stuff goes away. Is that also a factor in this?
It's absolutely a factor. And so my book is very practical. And what I hope to teach is how people can lean into the opportunity at the end of their loved one's life, because the closer we get to it, the more experience that we have with it, the more the less death anxiety we have, and the greater our competency and our confidence is. So we see opportunities to be of service when a loved one is aging or ill or failing in any way, and we move closer and we are able to make a difference at the end of life instead of feeling hopeless and helpless.
Well, I love that. I love that phrase that you use, lean into. We're going to talk more about that. I think that one of the greatest ways that you start the conversation in this book is you tell your own story. It's so meaningful to me. I was telling my wife about it soon after I read it, and she just got all excited about it. It explains the reason that you do this work, and it makes it just makes so much sense as to why it explains why this is so important. Why don't you tell us the story that sort of became the catalyst for the work that you do, that began at the age of 13?
Mm-hmm. When I was 13, my mother was ill with Guillain-Barré, and in the 60s in Hawaii, where I was born and raised, there were 7 known cases of Guillain-Barré, and everyone was dying. But in my family, with the right intentions, I believe, my mother and father did not talk about her illness. They didn't educate us, and so we didn't know what was coming, and therefore we couldn't prepare. So on a morning when I was 13, and my brother told me that my mother was especially ill, I did the only thing that I knew how to do when I was 13, and that was to take my 2 younger brothers away from home to play at the beach, thinking that my mother would be able to sleep and rest. I didn't know she was dying.
Yeah.
And so we left the home, and later that afternoon when I came home, I walked into her room, her bed was empty, and she was gone. And there was a note from a friend who's saying that she had taken my mother to the hospital, and my mother died in the hospital without me ever being able to see her or say goodbye. And my family never talked about how she died, why she died, what the cause was. But just a week before that incident, my mother was very loving and open, and I clearly remember her standing at the kitchen sink, and I walked by. I was a typical 13-year-old, and she turned around and looked at me and said, "Lani, I love you so much." I don't know whether she had a premonition of her death or not. Sure. She said, "Lani, I love you so much." And in atypical 13-year-old's way, trying to gain independence and break away, I just tisked and rolled my eyes and walked on. My mother died without me telling her, in my mind, without me telling her that I loved her. And so in the absence of information about why she died, I created my own reasoning. And it was a fantasy reality, but in my mind, and for decades afterward, I believed that my mother had died because she believed that her only daughter didn't love her enough. And so she hadn't fought to live. And I believed in my mind that my mother died alone. So the fantasy was truly much worse than the reality. But I lived with that image and that the meaning of her death in a very convoluted and shame-based way for years and years. But I remember after her death saying to myself, vowing, this will not be a tragedy in my life. I am going to find some good and some meaning in this. And never again could I couldn't cope with the thought that another loved one would die alone or without me. And so I was going to learn everything I could in my life so that that never happened again.
Now, and of course, that sets you off with the work that you do. We'll talk about that in a moment. But at that young age, how do you educate yourself about any of this? Bookstores, libraries?
Well, what I did to take care of myself at that time, because my father was doing such a good job as a single parent, but he wasn't talking about grief. And back in the 60s, nobody knew to do that.
Yep.
There weren't support groups for children who had lost parents and things like that. And I had no friends that had lost a parent.
Oh, wow.
And so I returned to school, but of course no one said anything directly to me. They just whispered behind my back, and I felt very different and shamed about that too. And so the way that I coped was just to write and write and write and write. I didn't have someone to talk to. I didn't have someone to ask questions of. And so I just started journaling and writing. So I've been writing for a very long time in my life to take care of myself. And then when I did go to college, it was the focus of my work. And went into counseling, and then when I was 29 years old, my life changed, and I had an accident and died. And that clarified even more strongly for me what I was to do, and that death was not the enemy, and death was not a tragedy, and really propelled me on into the second half of my work.
All right, so this is very interesting. So, obviously, I'm going to back up a little bit in a moment, but it's always interesting for me to hear our guests' stories, because so often with this bird's eye view, you can see how the universe has sort of put things in their way, yes. So that they end up with the calling that they have, and certainly your mother's passing is the beginning of that. And then you go to school and you study. What was it? Thanatology, maybe?
Yeah, that was my doctoral work. My Ph.D. was in psychology, and I specialized in thanatology, which was the study of death and dying.
Okay.
And then went on to teach a university course, develop a program to train others in that.
By the time you were 29 and you had the near-death experience, you're out of school by that time or not?
Well, I had my master's degree at that time.
Okay.
But when I was 29 years old, I was doing some side work, but raising my only child. So when this happened, I was a mother of a 2-year-old.
Oh, you were? Okay. And then you have this. But again, like I say, when you look at this bird's eye view of your passion forming over time, for you to have the experiences that you had as a child, and then go to school for the things that you went to school for, and then to have this near-death experience, amazes me to see that you're getting all the education that you need and the experiences that you need to really be able to help people with the work that you do.
Yeah, and it was after some formal education that I went into apply this in hospices, and it was really in those hospices, and it was really the direct contact with the patients that taught me the most. They taught me how to be with them, what they needed, and what made a difference. So they were my real educators.
And you say in the book, I mean, you have sat with people while they were passing, over 500 people?
Right, I've been with thousands of people in the dying process and grieving process, but at the bedside of over 500 at the moment that they passed.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing. That's amazing.
It was such a sacred opportunity. I mean, I take this so it it overwhelms me to be invited into the most intimate time of a person's life. It was such an honor, you know.
And I think people are going to recognize as we go forward, though, also why it's such a gift for them to have you there. That was definitely clear from what I understand about you and the way you treat people during that time. I want to back up a little bit because I'm a little more interested in your grief experience. You know, as a child, you know, it was interesting because it's probably not that unlike the grief experience of some adults, knowing that you really just didn't know what to do. You were uneducated in this area. Again, so many adults are as well because they've never had these conversations. I find it interesting. You had mentioned in your story that, you know, you went back to school fairly early, just kind of hoping maybe it would be a distraction to you, right?
I did, right. And it was the only, so I was in 8th grade at the time that my mother died. And it was the only place that had some routine and some, you know, boundaries that I just knew what to do. I could kind of go through the motions. Of course, at home, people were flailing but not talking about it. So it was a little more crazy making at home.
Yeah. And yet that had its issues in itself because of the way people treated you or looked at you or all sorts of things, right?
Right.
I like the idea, though. You had talked about this, you wrote about what one girl said to you in school.
Yeah.
Tell us what she said and why that was so significant to you.
Well, you know, after all these years, so we're talking 45 years ago this happened to me, and I can still so clearly remember the kindnesses of a few people who did risk and step out to say something to me, even though I'm sure they were thinking, oh my gosh, I don't want to say the wrong thing or I don't know what to say. But clearly I remember one friend who walked over 3 miles each way to get to my mother's memorial service. Wow. The kindness of a 13-year-old to do that, you know.
Yeah.
And then the other thing was another girl, another 13-year-old, was the only one to write me a note and just said in her note, I'm sorry to hear about your mother. You must be so sad. Yeah. But just that acknowledgement, that validation that I was seen and that this was a real event in my life and that it was important was so touching, and I will never forget her or her kindness.
And that's a big part of it, isn't it? I mean, part of your message, which is that people just don't want to ignore the elephant in the room. They need to talk about it with somebody, right? I mean, you don't have to have any. You can't fix it, obviously. You don't have to necessarily have anything to say that's necessarily going to help. Just listening, really.
Right. And what I tell people is that so my goal is that no one has to die alone, but also that no one has to grieve alone, because it's the greatest pain in dying and in grieving is feeling emotionally abandoned. That's our greatest suffering. And so if we can connect, what I tell people is that you don't have to know how to do it perfectly. There is no perfect. But just participate. Please participate. Again, lean into another person's dying or lean closer to another person's grieving and just be an authentic presence for them that shows your own unique way of sharing compassion.
All right, so now in 2003, how many years later? This is 40 years later or something? I don't even know. The story sort of comes full circle, you know. Tell us about that.
It is a full circle story because I had spent my life vowing that another loved one would not die alone. And I had prepared myself both academically and also experientially. And I really felt as though I knew how to make a difference at the end of someone's life. And sure enough, in 2003, I was 50 years old and I was teaching Death and Dying at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. And I was in private practice helping others grieve and cope at the end of their life. And I got a phone call from my father, who at the time was 83, I think, and saying, Lani, you know that pneumonia that we thought I had? Well, it turns out that it's end-stage lung cancer. And I said, okay, we can do this. And I closed my practice. I canceled my university classes. I said to my husband, I'm going home to Hawaii, and I'll probably be gone for 6 months. I hoped it would be 6 months.
Yeah.
And so I flew home, and I moved in with him, and I was his primary caregiver. And it was a great relief to him. He wasn't going to have to do this alone, that there would somebody, he knew that there would be someone there to advocate for him, to emotionally support him, and to physically care for him. And end-stage cancer, when you have stage 4 cancer, usually hospice will say you have up to 6 months to live. So of course I was hoping for 6 months. When I got there, I was very direct about everything. I had a family meeting and talked about his dying and asked him directly what he wanted. Very direct questions so that everyone could hear the same message at the same time in his language. And I asked him questions such as, where do you want to be when you die? Who do you want to be with you? Who do you not want to be with you? What do you want to be hearing? What do you want to be seeing? Very, very direct experiences that we could set up. What I was trying to do was give him as much control at the end of his life as possible.
Yeah.
Because when a person is dying, what happens is they lose control. So I wanted him to be the author of his death as he had been the author of his life. And I was there as his advocate to make sure that his wishes were followed. So we laid that all out. And just 13 days after I arrived, I was sitting at his bedside, holding his hand, and he reached up and took the oxygen tube out of his nose. And I said, Dad, you need the oxygen or you'll die soon. And he said, no more. And I said, are you saying you don't want the oxygen anymore? So I'm clarifying what his decision is. He says, no more. And I said, do you want me to turn the oxygen off? And he said, yes. So I said, I'll be right back. I ran down the hall, turned off the noisy oxygen machine, came back, got on his bed, held him in my arms, and just gently caressed him and sang to him. And his eyes were closed. And they were closed for about 30 or 40 minutes. And I was just there breathing with him very gently, telling him the very few things that are important at the end of his life. I love you. Your life mattered. I will never forget you. Thank you. And after about 40 minutes, his eyes opened wide and he looked at the corner of the room and he said his nickname for my mother, Duchess. I said, of course she's here, Dad. You can go to her. Just let go and go to her. And that was, he took his last breath. I was singing a favorite Hawaiian song to him. He took his last breath and he died in my arms. And it was gentle. It was his death. It was a perfect death. And that experience changed my grief. So sad. But I didn't grieve in the same way that I grieved with my mother, because I knew I had made a difference. I knew I had done everything I could. I knew he knew. And there was no shame, and there was no regret. And it was my last gift to him. It was his last gift to me.
Yeah.
Because there was such a healing in it.
It's beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. It's tough to move on from that. Let me just say, I think we can learn a lot from that story, and I think that one of those things is, I know when I was reading about it, and even while you were saying it, was what goes through your mind is, I want to know what to do. I want to know what to do the way she knew the proper things to say, the proper things to do.
What's in the book?
And it's all in this book, and again, another reason, it's just, if people were to buy 12 copies and give them to their closest friends and family members, the gift that they'd be giving them for just this reason alone that you described. For instance, how many people would try to get him to put the oxygen back on. I mean, isn't that just sort of a common reaction?
It is a common reaction, and when we are prepared ahead of time, you see, there wasn't a fear. First of all, I knew he was going to die, so there wasn't a denial about that. And I wasn't afraid about the process because I knew what to look for. I knew he was dying. But I wasn't, to put the oxygen back on is often for the person who's grieving. We're afraid of his death. Right. Rather than him being afraid. But again, I go back to what were his wishes. And that became the mantra in my family, so that there was never any disagreement about his care, because the question always was, what would Dad want? Yeah. What did Dad, lay out for us? And it was very clear who he was and what he wanted. And I say that, a person gets this death, they get this life, they get this death, and they get their vote. It wasn't my vote. It should have been his vote, and he got it.
You gave another example in another interview that I listened to about an elderly woman who wanted to go back to some community meeting or something, and she wanted to smoke on the way there. Could you tell us that story, because I think it's significant in relation to what we're talking about?
Yeah, I love good old. I'll call her Eva. She was a very feisty woman, and an important member of her community. She was a real advocate out there, and she was dying of lung cancer, and she smoked like a chimney, and hospice had been called in, and I was her the primary person there. And at the end of her life, she wanted to go to this one community meeting. There was a vote that was important to her, and she couldn't walk there, and so we put her on a wheelchair. Put her in a wheelchair with, and she was smoking like a chimney into the meeting. And later, the hospice was very angry at me because they said that I should have taken the cigarette away from her because she was setting a bad example. This is her life and this is her death. And if this comforts her at the end of her life, who are we to take that comfort away? In fact, that's what we are here for. And everyone has a different self-soothing method. Another cigarette was not going to cause her death, and if it did, it was still her choice. So again, I'm going to be there to support a person's choice, whether I agree with it or not. And that's very, very important, that if I'm there in service to another person, of course I bring information that might affect and help a person's discomfort or pain, but I am not there to change their mind. I'm there to support their choices. Yeah,
the last choices that they get to make, right?
Understand, I have to accept. And it's a big difference if I can teach that to families, that mom's wishes, we're there to accept them, not to agree with her or understand them, but to accept them.
That's beautiful. That's such a difference between those two things. Yeah. Wow. All right. And you talked about your father's, what I would refer to, and maybe some of our audience here would refer to as a deathbed vision, when he saw your mother. I know having sat with over 500 people during their death process, I'm sure you've seen many of these, have you not?
It's very, very common. And one of the things that I try to teach through hospices and in family situations is that we can offer comfort when we validate a person's experience. So these deathbed visions, as you call them, pre-death visions, are of such comfort to people who are dying, because pretty consistently they are always a visit from a loved one who's previously deceased. And those loved ones come to the person who's dying to say, don't be afraid, you won't be alone, I'm here, and you'll be okay. Why would anyone take that sense of comfort from a loved one. So my response to those situations is usually, of course they're here. Where else would they be?
Well, certainly. First, I want to say I like pre-death visions a lot better than I like deathbed visions. I don't know why. It just sounds a lot nicer. But from, of course, having had the near-death experience that you had, I mean, in your mind, it's also in a course. I mean, but it would have been even if you hadn't had that, correct? I mean, to not argue with them about what it is that they're experiencing is sort of the key here.
Right. I want to honor a person, you know, and so honoring means accepting their experience and the meaning that they attribute to it. I want to hear someone. I want to listen. Want to listen.
Well, let's take this then to the next section, which is, you know, I don't know, what dying people want and need. I want to talk a little bit about this. You have a chapter titled "How We Die Matters." Tell us a little bit about that chapter, "How We Die Matters."
Well, how we die matters because what the dying, all these thousands of people that I've been with have taught me, what they've taught me. This is their legacy that I want to pass on, you know? This is their voice. What they have taught me is that at the end of life, it is not their pain that they're most afraid of, especially if they're connected to hospice or palliative care. We can take care of people's physical pain. The emotional pain is often more difficult because it addresses the need for forgiveness and to forgive others, to finish our business and to find meaning in our life. But it's not pain that the dying are most afraid of. It's not even their imminent death that they're most afraid of, because at the end of life, when the body can't be repaired or put back together and the quality of life is no longer there, death is a way out. Death can be a relief. And I want people to honor that too, that experience, that it's okay if it's a relief, you know? But what the dying have told me is that their greatest pain, as I've said, is the feeling, the experience of being emotionally abandoned. When people do move away, when they don't talk about what's really going on for the dying person, when they dismiss, when they minimize the dying person's visions or what they want to talk about, and they lose such an opportunity. This is their last opportunity to connect to their loved one and to love and to be of service. But when we don't talk about what's real, there's no connection. It's such an empty feeling. So we can change. We can make a difference. I'm talking about those of us who are caregivers, those of us in the family. We can make a difference in how the dying experiences their death. And we can help the dying person to live right up to their last breath, because we can bring quality and intimacy and connection and love. So that, because, you know, one of the things is that a person who has just received a terminal illness, the people around them start treating them right then as though they're already dead, as though they're already gone.
Wow.
And so miss this last, you know, this last lap of life. And so much can happen, because the people who really engage when a person is dying, both the dying and the family will say, you know, this was the richest time of our relationship. This is the time that I felt closest. This is the time that was most real, this and honest. This is when we said the most important stuff. But if you don't lean in, if you don't see this as an opportunity, you'll pull away.
Another chapter you have, Making a Difference in a Dying Person's Life. You give a lot of examples of different things that people can do. I'm curious, you know, even for someone who's not able or willing to make a commitment like you made with your father, or even near that, you know, what about, you know, the nieces and the nephews and the grandchildren? What kind of things can they do to make a difference in maybe their grandparents' life? Last
That's
days.
a really great question, and one of the things that I do in hospice is to go into a family and really try to encourage the entire family, from the oldest to the youngest, to participate, because a young child, that 5-year-old, first of all, here's an opportunity to not teach them to be afraid of death, to see the process. And it doesn't have to be a mystery. And in fact, the child can understand some of the things as a 5-year-old. But it's that 5-year-old that I want to put up on grandma's bed and have him snuggle into grandma. And it's that 5-year-old who will say to grandma, tell me again the story of your life. Because one of the things that the dying need is that they need to tell their story so that they can find the meaning of their life. But so often adults will say to that person who is repeating stories, oh, you already told me that.
Right.
Right. And so again, they cut them off, they minimize the importance of this step toward the end. But a child will participate. Tell me again, grandma, tell me again, you know. Yeah. And so it's a great service. And also you see that little child is leaning into grandma and touching her. Yeah. Which is another thing that the dying need. They need the physical contact, they need the warmth, they need the feedback that they are still alive and that they're beautiful and important in the world, and it's that child that can do that. Yeah. So a child can listen, a child can touch. I'll have a young child brush grandma's hair or massage lotion into her dry hands. A child can sit and do their homework with grandma just to companion them. There's a lot of things that children in the family can do. And then other people in the family who maybe there's someone in that family who is not comfortable with touch. Okay, there's a lot that can be done. One person who's comfortable with a computer but isn't necessarily a people person, they can be doing a lot of the research about this illness. Someone else can be in charge of errands and going and getting the medication. Another person can be in charge of keeping a binder of all the medical information that continues to change. It's a big job. Oh, yeah. Else can be the person who just sits up at night and you know, watches over the dying person so that other people can sleep. Yeah. So that they can do the work during the day. There are a myriad of jobs that are very, very important. I mean, you know, it takes a village.
Is it a comfort to someone in this situation when others are just sitting there? Maybe there isn't necessarily a conversation going on, or do many of them feel as though they have to entertain, you know, from their bed? Is this a conversation you need to have with them to let them know, I'm just here to be with you, you don't need to entertain me?
Yes, it is. But that has everything to do with that caregiver's level of acceptance and peace about this process. So someone who's not comfortable with the dying process might walk into the room and be very busy, you know, plumping pillows or adjusting blinds or talking about the weather. That is not comforting. That is not comforting. But someone who just sits at the bedside and is comfortable with silence, offers to listen when the dying person wants to talk, but doesn't offer advice, you know, is just there almost as a container. Let me hold your experience for you is often the way I want to see myself. You know, I think so often we can feel another person's level of anxiety. Yeah. And if you're anxious and I'm a mother, yes, I might try to take care of you even though I'm dying. Yeah. And it's exhausting. Right. So I would prefer to have someone with me who feels okay, who isn't afraid of me or my dying process and can just be, offers me their presence. Right. Right. That's interesting. Presence. And you talk a lot about that too, but that seems really, really important, and really important for any one of us to learn how to just be present. You know, so many people, you can't be with them unless somebody's talking. You know, they don't, you know, silence bothers them, right? This is not one of those situations where this is one of those situations where you want to learn how to be silent, how to be present, how to listen,
be there for them. You know, a lot of people, would this be a good time, or is this a bad idea for anyone to record one's history in one way or another? That's a lovely idea. Yeah, at the end of my father's life, I recorded a lot of his stories because, you know, one of the things that the bereaved tell me is I miss
I miss their hand. And so one of the things I do is I'll say, take a picture of your loved one's hand.
Yeah.
And take a picture of your loved one's hand holding your hand.
Yeah.
Another thing I'll suggest is to record, because so often after death, one of the things we really miss is their voice.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yes, record their stories, record them on in photos, have them tell their stories. Another thing that I do is, and I did with my father, is that you can write your loved one's obituary with them, which is a wonderful opportunity to sit with them and review their scrapbooks and to say, Dad, what does this picture mean to you? Why is this important? Who was this person in your life? And you know, who were your heroes, Dad? And how did they help shape you? And so together, my dad and I wrote the story of his life. And I was so glad we did that, because I thought I knew him better than anyone in the world. Yeah. But in fact, right up at the end, I was learning all these fabulous things about him that I have now, you see?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then he could say, again, he was the author of his life. And he could tell people how he wanted to be remembered.
Well, that's it. I mean, are some people uncomfortable writing their obituary or even talking about death? I mean, you have to find out whether they are or not at the beginning, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But, you know, if we are comfortable as a caregiver, then there's an invitation for them to explore or to bring things like even their feelings. I'm angry about dying, or I'm sad about dying, instead of, oh, don't think that way, don't talk like that, you know. No, let them explore it, let them process, let them be where they are. And also, you know, I never try to take away someone's denial.
Sure.
And I never take away someone's hope. And let me say that even at the end of life, and this is kind of a different concept, but even at the end of life, when you have received a terminal diagnosis and the doctor has said there is no more treatment left, there is no hope for being cured, we are not without hope. We can reframe hope, and that's one of the things that we can do for our loved one, is we can point out the many, many things that we can still hope for right up to the end. We can hope for compassion. We can hope for a comfortable or peaceful death. We can hope for no pain. We can hope to be surrounded by our loved ones. We can hope to die where we choose. See, there's still a great deal of hope in the how we die.
Right. What about those people who are still hoping for a recovery? Now, you were with a lot of people, you say, you know, maybe thousands of people. Any of those have a miraculous recovery? Walked out of the hospice? I've actually heard of stories that people have walked out of hospice. Did that ever happen with anyone you knew?
There are cases where people are fired from hospice, and because they recover and the doctor no longer says, you know, you have less than 6 months.
Okay.
You know, they might go in and out, and they might return to hospice.
Sure.
Again, you know, oftentimes I'll get the question, well, how long do they have to live? How long do they have to live? Yeah. And I don't think it's about length. I think it's about quality. Yeah. So my question back to them is, whether it's 3 weeks or 3 months, the real question is, what are you going to do with whatever time you have?
Yeah. All right, so you do talk about your near-death experience in the book and other things. How helpful is it to the person who's dying to learn about the afterlife?
I follow their lead.
You follow their lead. Do you open? I mean, can you try to open the subject and see if they're interested at all?
Yes, I think a person can ask the dying what are their beliefs. One of the ways to do that is, what's your greatest fear about dying?
Are there common ones?
Well, I would say the most common one is that no one's going to be with me when I die. I'm going to be left alone. And another common fear is I won't be remembered. Okay? So if I know that is their fear, then I'm going to spend a great deal of time comforting and talking to them about how I will remember them, how they will be with me for the rest of my life, how I will see them in the world, when I will remember them, okay? What their legacy, what their life means to me, and what they have passed on to me, okay? So when I identify a person's fear, I know what the solution might be.
That's beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. And okay. And now with you, you've had the near-death experience. Did you ever have that conversation with your father?
I did.
You did?
Yes. I didn't talk about that experience for about 5 years because I didn't know anyone who had had that experience, and I didn't even have the language really to discuss it. And this was in the early 80s. But it was also the most profound experience of my life, and I didn't want people nitpicking it apart. I didn't tell my father for about maybe 10 years, and then finally it dawned on me that I might die before he did, and that I just needed to pass it on, not proselytize, not try to change his mind, but just share my experience because I had seen his wife. I had been in the presence of my mother again, and it healed me, and so perhaps it might make a difference to him. So I did tell him, and I prefaced it by saying, I just want to share an experience with you, and I'm not asking you to believe me or anything. I just feel that I have to pass it on, and you may do with it whatever you want. And as I told him my story, tears ran down his eyes, and the only thing he said was, I needed to know your mother was okay. And I learned so much, Bob, in that experience, which has helped me with my work with the dying, but I don't think someone needs to have that experience in order to be helpful.
No.
But in the near-death experience, I learned without a shadow of a doubt, I mean, with every fiber of my being, I know that in death there is healing. So my mother died broken, and when she was there in the tunnel to catch me, she was vibrant and beautiful and whole and healed. And so I also know that we never die alone, that there's always someone there to greet us. And I know without a shadow of a doubt that there is no such thing as even needing to be forgiven, that this light that you can call by any name, it doesn't matter. This love, this unconditional love is what we're all made of and what connects us all. And I know that there's no fear and no need to, that death is not a tragedy. It's another.
All right, breathtaking. I read the whole chapter about your near-death experience last night to my wife. Just had to share it with her. One of those things. We could spend the whole episode on it. I chose. We'll just talk about it. People can read about it if they want to. Because I feel like this other information is something that we haven't covered yet, and therefore important. But it's there. What I loved about it was sort of classic near-death experience. Not wanting to come back.
Right.
I thought it was interesting. You talked about some of the guilt even you went through later about not wanting to come back, where you have a husband and children, but it teaches you about what that experience is like, what it's like to be there, and we're all going to be there one day.
So much love that you wouldn't, so much love and peace and serenity that there's just, oh my goodness, yeah. So I argued. I just said no. I didn't want to come back, which was why I didn't talk about it in large part for 5 years, because I thought no one would understand a mother saying no when she had a young child who needed her.
That's right.
And it wasn't that I was saying no to my child or my husband. It was that I was saying yes to this love.
That's right, exactly, and you're looking at it from a completely different perspective there. I'm sure even at that moment you probably didn't feel disconnected from your family members,
I didn't feel disconnected, but I wasn't an ego.
Yeah.
I wasn't a personality.
Yeah. It makes it very, very different, doesn't it?
Yes, there was a much higher perspective.
Yeah. All right.
Everything is with the world.
Yeah. All right. So we just have a few minutes left, and I just want to let people know that this book isn't just about dealing with people who are dying. This book is also about people who are grieving. And so I just want to cover a couple things briefly. It's
and
almost
Bob,
really...
actually, a lot of people have said to me that it's not a book necessarily about dying or grieving. It's a book about how to live.
And certainly opens up conversations about death. You know what I mean? That we never probably have ever had before. We get to hear from someone who has had a great deal of experience around death, and you open up the conversation in ways that many of us wouldn't even know how to open it up. In talking about grief, you talk about the key to resolving grief. There's the key to... Tell us what that is.
The key to resolving grief is validation. Again, like the dying process, to be held and validated, to be listened to, that this is my experience, these are my feelings. To be companioned in grief is the greatest support. So
there's a theme going on here. People just need to be listened to and not judged, and just accept their experience as it is.
Right, and each grief is different, so that if I'm going to be helpful to you when you're grieving, I need to not compare how you grieve to someone else, because then I judge, right?
Yeah.
So I don't want to judge, I don't want to compare, I don't want to make any assumptions about how you should grieve, and I certainly don't want to give you a formula about how long you should grieve. And a lot of people do that. I mean, even when they say, "Aren't you over it yet?"
Yeah. No, move on. You're right.
Grief, lifetime.
Where did you learn that in your work? I mean, did you always know this? Did you go into working, with hospice, knowing this already? Is this something you learned in school, or is this something you learned through experience?
Well, I think I learned a lot of it through experience. I think I learned a lot of what was helpful and meaningful to me starting from when I was 13. And not even... what was helpful and what wasn't. And then I just listened to other people who were grieving.
Yeah.
And people ask for help because there are so many people in our culture who just don't want to go there. They don't want to listen.
Yeah.
They want you, quick, move on.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess they get nervous, and then I think there's also a point where they recognize now they're grieving the friendship because that person's no longer the same person they were, or the friendship's not the same as it was. And so that comes from a very selfish place, I would imagine.
Well, I think it comes from a place of their grief that they have not resolved or touched.
Yeah.
So, a person who's doing grief counseling really can only take another person as far as they've gone.
Yeah. That's great. That's classic right there. You also talk about how children grieve differently than adults. Can you give us a couple examples?
Well, children do grieve differently because there are concepts of death that a child needs to understand in order to fully understand death, and they don't, depending on their family, depending on their experience, the vocabulary that's used in the family, and what's shared. A child doesn't necessarily fully understand death until maybe they're about 10. So at age 5, a child might not understand that there is a cause for death. So death doesn't just happen to someone, there's a reason for death. Children also need to understand that death is irreversible. And, when you and I were growing up, we used to see the Roadrunner cartoons.
Yeah.
Remember, Roadrunner was smashed by a boulder, and what happened? He immediately jumped up and came back to life.
Yeah.
So children need to know that once dead, they don't come back. And another concept that a child needs to understand is that a body doesn't function after death. So a 5-year-old, it would be very common for a 5-year-old to ask me, does Daddy go to the bathroom in heaven? So he's still believing that the body functions.
Yeah.
And know where a child is in their understanding of death, again, listening to questions.
So there are some things you should not say to children in reference. There's some common ideas, common things that are said to children. I heard in an interview that you gave, you were sort of giving a little list of some of the things that probably shouldn't be said to children, such as they've gone to sleep.
Right. We want to use, just like sex education, body parts have very specific, real vocabulary attached to them, and we should use the real terminology with death. So when I'm talking to a child, I will say, "Mommy died." I don't say, "Mommy went to sleep forever." I don't say, "Mommy went away." I never say that, because the child, feels abandoned, and then we go into the whole shame and meaning of that. But "Mommy died," and mommy can't use her body anymore. And then, depending on the family's belief system, I'll either, support their belief about, we believe that mommy is in heaven, and what does that mean to you? So, but we need to repeat the facts often to children. And sometimes if adults don't understand that, they'll get exacerbated by, why that child comes back every night and says, "Where's Daddy?"
Yeah, right.
Because they don't understand that Daddy is not coming back. It's a very long process to really, integrate that information.
If you don't know, though, how to, the proper way, the proper things to say, what's something good to sort of go by? Is it honesty? Is it? What would it be? Aside from maybe religious beliefs, that sort of a thing, in how to answer some of the children's questions.
Yes, I would be honest, and I would let the child lead. Yeah. So I want to answer the questions honestly and specifically and shortly, succinctly, depending on their question.
Yeah. And there's some, like the whole sleep thing, telling them, what would be the reason not to tell them that they've gone to sleep? Because the
child becomes afraid, terrified of going to sleep. Because if Daddy died because he went to sleep, right, then I could die when I go to sleep. But even more important than the child being fearful that they're going to die is being afraid that mommy's going to die.
Every time she goes to sleep.
Parent dies, the child's first concern is for their own safety. Who's going to take care of me? Who's going to take care of me? And so if Daddy has died, mom wants to be very careful about, I am here, I am going to take care of you, you are safe, I'm not going anywhere, and all of that. We really need to create a nest of safety for a child.
Okay. I was going to say, what can we briefly say, knowing that we only have a couple minutes left, about finding meaning in loss?
Oh, well, meaning is everything. Because you see, as death is death. But for example, in my instance, my mother died. How my family saw her death changed depending on the meaning. So one child in the family might think that mommy died and what it means is that she left me and I'm a bad person. Somebody else's meaning is mommy died because she had an illness and her body gave out and she didn't want to leave me. And so those two children's, the same incident happened in the family, but because the meaning is so different, those children will grieve very differently. Yeah. Their wounds will be very different, and really the relationships in life with others will be very different.
Yeah. Well, because we're running out of time, and again, as much as we've talked about, we've just covered a fraction of what you have written about. So again, I highly recommend this to people. This is going to be one of my favorite books to give away. Again, the book is No One Has to Die Alone. Below this video are links that people can buy it on Amazon. There's going to be a link to your website. What is your website domain name?
drlanileary.com.
All right.
So it's drlanileary.com.
That's great.
And it's a blog for Psychology Today.
Oh, really?
I blog there, and it's called, that column is called No One Has to Be Alone.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So it covers the gamut.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, let me just say, I really appreciate you taking the time of getting up early. You're in Hawaii. I'm in Maine. We were able to make this work thanks to Skype, and I want to thank you for writing this, because you allowed me to help open this conversation up with my loved ones, my family, my friends, in ways that I never would have been able to before, giving me more confidence in being able to deal with people who are in this situation. And I know when I get to that point, it's my turn to go. I will be educated on the best way to do it for me.
And less fearful and more peaceful.
Yeah. So thank you for all of that. And maybe we'll have you back again. We can talk about your near-death experience or something else, all right?
Thank you, Bob.
All right, take care now.
Aloha.